IO9 presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here are your hosts, John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 35 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hi, this is John Joseph Adams. I'm the editor of several anthologies, such as The Way of the Wizard and Brave New Worlds, and I also edit the magazines Fantasy and Lightspeed.
And I'm David Barr Kirtley. I'm the author of many short stories, including Veil of Ignorance, about a strange drug that causes a group of friends to share each other's thoughts. The story appeared in All the Rage this year, the Phobos Science Fiction Anthology 3, and in MechMuse Audio Magazine. And today on the show, we'll be interviewing Daniel Abraham. He's the author of the epic fantasy series The Long Price Quartet, and his latest novel is called The Dragon's Path, Book 1 in the Dagger and the Coin Quintet. He's also currently adapting George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones into graphic novel format.
All right, so let's get to our interview.
All right, so we're here with Daniel Abraham. Welcome to the show.
Why, thank you, sir.
Okay, so first of all, it was recently announced that you'll be adapting George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones into graphic novel format. Tell us about that.
Well, this is actually not the first thing of George's that I've adapted. I did Fever Dream and a novella of his called Skin Trade, but I've been doing that kind of thing with George for a few years now, actually.
So, I mean, what are some of the challenges you faced and lessons you've learned when it comes to writing graphic novel adaptations?
The things that really make prose snappy and fun and exciting don't actually work as graphic novels, don't work in comics. Because, when you're reading fiction, the thing that snaps is the dialogue, right? You get two people talking back and forth, and they got the whole thing going. It kind of keeps things moving fast. But if you put it in art, you get two heads talking to each other for pages. So the hard part of the adaptation is taking the parts of the story, the information that you can show visually, and taking it out of the dialogue and out of the summary and putting it into the images. And sometimes that's really graceful and easy, and sometimes it's, pulling teeth. With Game of Thrones in particular, Game of Thrones is a hard thing to adapt, especially the Daenerys line, because you kind of can't draw what he wrote. You can't film it either. I mean, one of the things that I'm interested to see with HBO is how they dealt with that. I think we've adopted some of the same strategies. I think a lot of the characters in the book are getting aged up when you put them into a visual medium. But, Daenerys in those books, she starts out at 13. And it's kind of a story about her sexuality. And it's really uncomfortable being, a 40-year-old guy talking about how to draw a 13-year-old sexuality. That's uncomfortable. So with that, we're, as with I think HBO, we're aging up characters, and that shifts what the story is to a certain degree.
There have been a couple instances recently where people have actually faced criminal charges for possessing comic books. I don't know. I was just wondering, have you followed any of those cases, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I'm aware of those cases. They've come up in conversation when we were talking about Daenerys. I am tremendously uncomfortable with those cases, and I'm uncomfortable because I am of two minds. On the one hand, I think that we're in a culture where the sexuality of adolescents really needs to be walled off from adult sexuality. I can't think in my experience or the experience of my friends or my family of any situation in which a young girl or young boy's sexuality has intersected with a genuinely adult world in a way that was good for anybody involved. Now, that's not necessarily the standard throughout history. That's not necessarily the standard throughout the world, but this is where we're living right now. And I got a daughter, guys. I got a kid. And if she brings home, if she's 13 and brings home a 20-year-old guy, I'm going to kill him. And the only reason I wouldn't kill him is that my wife would get to him first. That's the only reason. One of us would be there to make bail. And so that sexualizing, and I say sexualizing, 13-year-olds have a sexuality, but it's not my business. Hasn't been my business since I was 13. The stories and the entertainment that is presented to me as an adult about those populations, I think is really suspect and really dangerous. And on the other hand, just because something is suspect or dangerous doesn't mean it ought to be illegal. I would love for there to be a good, clean line I could draw through this. I would love that. I don't see it. And especially when you come to a comic book or, something in which there are no actors, there are no actual 13-year-olds involved, it's all just thought. I have a very hard time saying that ought to be illegal. Stigmatized. I'm comfortable with stigmatized. Icky. I'm comfortable walking around saying it's icky and wrong and I don't like it, but I don't think I can call it criminal. I want to. I don't think I can.
Okay, so you've collaborated with George R. R. Martin on a number of projects. How did that all start?
It started back in 1998. I was at the Clarion West workshop in Seattle, and George was one of my professors. George and Gardner both. And George lives about an hour north of me. And when I got back to town, we wound up spending some more time together. We were in some of the same critique groups. And when a project came up, like Wild Cards, where he was looking for a variety of people to do it, I was one of the names that came up. And when Hunter's Run's kind of the big one. That's the novel that George and Gardner and I all did. And the way that happened was back when I was in grade school, Gardner started writing this story. And, did a fair chunk of it, and then kind of ran out of steam and wound up taking it to a workshop. I think I would have been in early high school, like maybe sophomore year of high school, when he took it to a workshop with George. And, George liked it more than some of the other folks necessarily did, and they decided to go ahead and collaborate on it. And so Gardner gave it to George, and George wrote a section on it and handed it back to Gardner, and then there's that. And over the years, they had kind of poked around looking for maybe a third collaborator, somebody who would be interested in taking it and finishing it off. And most people have the good sense not to, and I didn't. So one night, 5 years ago, something like that, I went out to dinner with George, and he said, "So, Daniel, how would you feel about a three-way with two old fat guys?" And I said, "You've been practicing that line, haven't you?" And they gave me the manuscript, and that actually wound up being a novella called Shadow Twin. And it was a good novella. I worked out pretty well. We sold it to Asimov's and to, I think the first one we sold to actually was Sci Fiction, back when Ellen Datlow was running the website. And we kind of came to the conclusion that there was some story that hadn't been told, even with the novella. So we expanded it. We made it, actually we threw out the original book entirely. We threw out the novella and wrote the whole thing again from scratch, making it bigger and expanding on the world and changing the plot a little bit here and there. And it wound up being the novel Hunter's Run. Because if we had kept it Shadow Twin, then there would have been the chapbook Shadow Twin that was the novella and another separate book with completely different content by the same authors with the same title, and that sounds like a bad idea.
Mm-hmm. And you're also collaborating with George's assistant, Ty, right?
Yes, we are. We're coming out with a book called Leviathan Wakes. It's a space opera. It's coming out in June from Orbit. It's the first book in a series called The Expanse.
And it's under the byline James Corey, right?
James S.A. Corey. I am the James half. He is the Corey half.
So how'd that byline come about?
Well, I have this thing about pseudonyms. I think that they are, generally speaking, a good idea, and I can go into that if you want. But how we came out with that particular one is my middle name is James and his middle name's Corey, so we just sort of stuck them together. And he wanted to have my kid in the mix someplace, and her initials are SA, so we put her in the middle.
So why do you think pseudonyms are a good idea?
I think that the way you win as a writer is you meet people's expectations. And I think one of the ways you meet people's expectations is you set them. And I think the name of the writer is part of what sets them. There was this time, here's my kind of standard anecdote on this one. There was a WorldCon a few years back, and Walter Mosley was there. You guys know Walter Mosley?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, Easy Rawlings, etc.
Yeah. So he was there, and he had done some science fiction in addition to his mystery stuff. And he was telling this story about going into a bookstore, and one of his science fiction books was there in the mystery section. So he picked it up, and he took it up to the info desk, and he told them, this is misshelved. It's in mystery, and it should be in science fiction. And the guy at the info desk said, oh, no, that's by Walter Mosley. He writes mystery. And Mosley said, I'm Walter Mosley. And he said he could see the guy trying to say, and you write mystery, right there. When an author has any level of success, they become identified with the successful work. That's what happened sort of to Donaldson, to Stephen R. Donaldson. There was a quote, I don't know if he ever actually said it, this might be apocryphal, but when the second Chronicles of Thomas Covenant were finished, he said, I thought I had 1 million Stephen R. Donaldson fans, I had 1 million Thomas Covenant fans. When he went over to do the Gap series, the fans didn't follow him.
Which is a real shame, actually, because that's a great series. I love that series.
Yeah, no, and, he's still just as good a writer as he ever was. It's just that when you start changing what you're delivering, do you ever have this? This is another example I always use. Do you ever do the thing where you forgot that you ordered a Coke and you think it's iced tea? And then you take a sip of it and you think, oh my God, what the hell was that? It's kind of the same thing. In my case, I'm writing epic fantasy under Daniel Abraham. I'm writing urban fantasy under MLN Hanover, and I'm writing space opera as James Corey. It doesn't matter how good an urban fantasy I write. If you're kind of primed to read epic fantasy, it's not going to be that good. So by changing the name of the author, part of what I get to do is say, no, look, this is something else.
Okay, so one of the first things you wrote that made a big splash was a very dark story called Flat Diane, which appeared in the magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Can you tell us a bit what that was about and what sort of response you got from it?
That was a really interesting project. There's this Flat Stanley project that's an actual real thing. And I had a cousin who was named Maxine. And I was at a family wedding, and Maxine's parents were there, and they were talking about how they had taken Maxine and they had done this kind of tracing of her, and they had sent it out on adventures. So they would mail it to somebody, and then Flat Maxine would be there, and they'd send out pictures of Maxine, like at the Eiffel Tower, or, in Scotland with family, or, New York, or wherever Maxine was traveling, right? And then the letters and pictures would come back to the real Maxine, and she could see kind of a better picture of the world and the people she knew and get to kind of understand the scale of things. And they thought this was all really cool. And I was sitting there thinking, I'm a rationalist. I have no superstitious bone in my body, but you just put your kid's soul in the mail? You're nuts. And I came up with the idea of somebody mailing out their kid's soul and it going astray. And that turned into a story called Flat Diane. It has made a certain reputation as a horror story. It won the International Horror Guild Award. And I didn't know it was a horror story. Some very, very unpleasant things happen in it. But when I wrote it, my wife was working early intervention with kids between 0 and 3. And this is a child molestation story. But it's a child molestation story in which the kid isn't really physically being molested. People know about it. They can do something about it, and they care, which makes it a more pleasant story than your average social worker's average week. So I respect that it's a disturbing story and that it reads as horror, but boy, that wasn't my experience of it.
Okay, so I mean, another story of yours that's gotten a lot of attention is called The Canvassed and Lured Iron, a fairy tale of economics. What's that story about, and how'd you come up with the idea?
Well, the idea came from the anthology it was in. Our mandate on that one was to take winning words from the National Spelling Bee and build stories around them. And the one I picked was canvassed, which is a money changer. And it was interesting because I hadn't actually done any short stories for a while when I took on that assignment. And I got canvassed and I thought about it and I worked it up and I wrote this story and it was crap. It was terrible. It was a very bad story. And I looked and I thought, oh, I have forgotten how to write short stories. That's a pity. And I went off to the library and I borrowed a bunch of books of short stories, and I read short stories for a couple of weeks until I kind of remembered how to do it again. And what I came up with was a fairy tale. I took this kind of very standard fairy tale structure in which there are 3 tests. And each of the tests has kind of a larger scale. And in the process of all of this, the hero is saved or ennobled, or everybody gets what they need as a result of them. Only instead of having it be magical tests, I had it be kind of, Freakonomics level Economics 101 classes. And that's what it turned into. And it was really nice because there were a certain number of actual economists who read and responded to the story when it came out. Brad DeLong and Paul Krugman got into a little conversation about it online. That was pretty much the best thing that's happened to me. Pretty close.
I mean, is economics something you're interested in? Did you do any research or anything for that story?
I didn't do it for that story in particular. It's something that interests me, and it has interested me probably for 8 or 9 years. I don't have any kind of formal training in it. I read the popular economics books, and I listen to the Planet Money podcast from NPR, and having that kind of set of tools to think about problems, thinking about, okay, what is the opportunity cost? Whatever you're going to do, what's the opportunity cost? Oh, right, okay. What are the incentives on something? Oh, okay. Even though I think there are some assumptions at the base of modern economics, at least, that are clearly wrong. Economics is based on the idea that we're all rational actors who will work in our own self-interests. That's not my experience of people.
I think I'd just be curious to know what you think, because I wonder about this a lot, is that, people call economics the dismal science, and it has these assumptions that just seem crazy, like rational actors with access to perfect information and stuff like that. But then you get people like Paul Krugman who seem to make pretty accurate predictions, but then you get lots of other economists who seem to be just as well educated, say, but their predictions are completely wrong. Do you have any just take on any of that?
Well, one of the expectations is that economists are rational. I think that's probably optimistic. I think that one of the things that's true of anybody who's making up a narrative, and economists fit into that. Economists and storytellers and politicians, anybody who's creating a narrative is in real danger of imposing the narrative they've already got on the information they have at hand. I think that Paul Krugman has something of a liberal bias, and I think reality has something of a liberal bias. That's me, right? That's the story I'm telling. So I think his expectations and predictions have been pretty good and continue to be. But I don't know how you go into something like that. I mean, if when you were 16 or 15 or whenever, when you were young and impressionable, you read Ayn Rand or, God forbid, knew her, which is, I think, what happened to Greenspan. I could be wrong about that. I think that changes who you are and changes your self-image and changes how you think the world works. And I don't know how you come into something with your prejudices intact and don't have that affect how you think things are going to play out. Now, for Greenspan, that was tragic. You saw him, here's one of the most respected men in the world standing up before Congress and saying that everything he thought about how the world works was wrong. And as a result, millions of people suffer. Millions of people are turned out of their homes. They don't lose their jobs because this guy was too impressed by Ayn Rand. That's harsh. And I think it's also very, very human.
So your latest novel is the first in a new series called The Dragon's Path. Can you tell us what that's about?
Well, what happened after I did the Long Prize Quartet, and they were kind of weird because I was doing a bunch of, I was thinking, what we really want in fiction is originality, right? Because that's what they tell us. And so I did this thing where it had a very, very idiosyncratic time structure with the 4 books, and it was in a non-European setting, and it was a very strange magic system, and it was doing a lot of things that I didn't see in fantasy very often, and it was great fun, and I'm really glad I did it. And then when I was done with that, I thought, what I want to do next is actually write a fantasy series, kind of like the ones that I grew up with, the ones I like. And I got a bunch of people together. I got them together at Melinda Snodgrass's house up in Santa Fe. And it was folks like George and Steve Sterling and Walter John Williams and Ian Tregillis, and Ty was there. And we spent a day talking about what epic fantasy was and what its strengths were and what it was about, and what kinds of psychological truths inform it and why it's cool. And I took that and I went away and I tried to build the structure of an epic fantasy that really played to those, that really kind of embraced the strengths of the genre. And then I took everything that I thought was cool and I used that. So I think the Medici Bank is really cool, so that's in there. And I think Walter Tevis's Queen's Gambit is really cool, and so that's in there. And I think that I really liked Babylon 5 and I really liked Firefly, so they're kind of in there. I ripped off a bunch of stuff that I really, really love. It's a world where in millennia back the dragons ruled the world and took humans and made slave races out of them. And then the dragons fell apart. The dragons all died off. The empire fell. And so for the last few millennia, it's been the humans kind of living in the ruins of the great empire. And the story that I'm telling is it's a paired story. There are 2 main kind of characters around whom events flow. One of them is a nobleman who is, despised and rises to power and becomes the regent of his land and leads his nation in a bid toward regaining greatness and kind of expanding in that great colonialist fashion. And the other one is where normally you would take the farm boy chosen to prophecy, and he will go on to save the world. I've taken an orphan girl who was raised by a bank, who will now go on to save the world.
Well, yeah. I thought it was interesting that we were talking about economics, and it seems like economics plays a role in this book as well. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think that the 2 ways that societies tend to interact with each other is either they make friends and intermarry and trade stuff, or they kill each other. That's the dagger and the coin. The dagger is war and the coin is trade. And I think we tell a lot of stories about war. And I think we tell very few stories about trade.
Hey, what you were saying earlier kind of reminded me of this thing I heard that where goods cross borders, troops don't, and where goods don't cross borders, troops do. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah. I don't really have heard that formulation of it, but that's absolutely the kind of ethos that I'm drawing from. That's the analysis that I believe in. And you have these wonderful examples. You have these wonderful medieval banks. I mean, those guys were fascinating. The way that there's this kind of constant love-hate relationship, this constant, we need to have the banks, but we hate all the bankers. But we want to have the money, but we hate all the people who lend us the money. The reason that usury was a sin, the reason that lending at interest was a sin in medieval Europe was that it could make rich men poor and poor men rich. just lending at interest, just being a banker, the absolute minimum thing that a banker does is destabilize society. If you have that medieval mindset where there is the great chain of being, here's somebody who's ignoring that, who's building against that, and is answerable to no king, and lives entirely on knowing things that other people don't know. That's what my culture venerates. We love that stuff. We think that's social mobility is a profound good thing, and that's bankers.
Although, I mean, at the moment, I think most people sort of look at bankers as the villains of our story. Did you?
Most people look at bankers as the villains of our stories because of what they've become. But most people still go to the bank when they want to get a house or a car. I
mean, did you write your story at all as sort of in any way as a reaction to current events, or was it just?
Most of the current events happened after I was already started.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I didn't get a chance to. But it's been really interesting to me watching that kind of unfold, because the thing that the difference between the world in kind of the medieval setting and the world I'm working in and the world we live in now is once upon a time there was a counterbalance to the forces of commerce. They had the church. If the church came and said, this is a sin, you can't do it, by God, they couldn't do it.
I mean, one thing that happens in the book is there are these characters who end up with a giant pile of money. And it never really occurred to me before, but as I was reading it, maybe, because it's a fantasy novel, it just occurred to me that there are a lot of parallels between a giant pile of money and Tolkien's One Ring, that it's has a lot of power and it draws trouble and it corrupts people around you. Was that a parallel that you were conscious of while you were writing it?
No, but I think it's really cool now that you say it. I think, the ring and money both are tokens of power, and I really think it's the power that has that drawing of trouble and that corrupting influence. I mean, money is magic too. There's nothing about money that makes it money except that we all agree to it. And if you define magic as an act of will having an effect upon the real world, that's what we did. We all agreed that gold was an abstract signifier of, value, whatever that is. And because we all agreed to that, you can have a cheap light bulb. You couldn't make a light bulb. I couldn't make a light bulb. I don't have the skills. No one does. Without having money, without having that magic, without having that kind of totally absurd act of collective will, you couldn't have any of the stuff we have now. The world would be completely different. We only don't call it magic because it works.
I actually think of that One Ring money comparison all the time when I deposit change in my Mount Doom piggy bank.
Hopefully it doesn't melt your money down, though.
Could you talk about the world building a little bit more? I mean, like Tolkien, famously did all this world building before he even started the plot. But I think most writers, probably the plot and the world building sort of are developed in tandem. I mean, how much of the stuff had you figured out before coming up with the plot, and how much of it sort of grew out of the plot?
Yeah, they all kind of come together for me. I knew that there were some things that I specifically wanted to do with making the world that the story happens in really, a fantasy world. I wanted to have that kind of sense of wonder in it, and I wanted to have, the great visual images. George has the wall and the Eyrie, and he has these amazing set pieces where you just go and you can imagine these places and see them. And I knew that I wanted to have those in there, and I knew I wanted to have a bunch of different kind of versions of my versions of the elves and the dwarves and the trolls and all those things that didn't actually borrow directly from the kind of classic ones, but I wanted to have that sense of exoticism and strangeness and difference and variety.
Well, like the guard dog who's sort of chained outside the front door for me is one of those sort of images you're talking about. That
oh, like the guard, the door slaves.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's Roman. I ripped that off directly.
But they didn't have dogs, though, right? I mean, dogmen,
Well, yeah, the dogmen are not Roman. But chaining them to the front door is. Chaining the slave to the front door is.
All right, well, is there anything else you're working on right now that you'd like to mention?
The four things I'm working on are the Dagger and the Coin series that we talked about, the space opera series with Ty, coming out under James S.A. Corey, that's coming out in June. And I would mention that if you decide to participate in that with your ebook reader, if you pick up The Dragon's Path or Leviathan Wakes, the fine folks at Tor throw in the other one, so you get two books either way you buy it. The comic book adaptation of A Game of Thrones, and I'm also writing urban fantasy under the pseudonym MLN Hanover. That's the Black Sun's Daughter series. First three of those are out. Fourth one's coming out in November.
All right, well, Daniel Abraham, thanks so much for joining us on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Thank you for having me.
And that was our interview. So thanks again to Daniel Abraham for joining us on the show. All right, so now John and I are going to be discussing the Game of Thrones TV show that just premiered on HBO. This will be the first we're talking about it. So, John, what'd you think?
Well, I thought it was pretty amazing. You and I and many of our friends were all big fans of the novel series, so we've read the book already. But it was really cool to see the way they brought it to life on the screen there. I thought it looked beautiful. I thought the casting for the most part was pretty spot on. It was really great. I assume you loved it as well.
I did, yeah. And although not as much as Doug, and I guess, for people who don't know, I'm talking about Doug Cohen. He's the editor of Realms of Fantasy magazine. And, he's one of our friends from New York. And we all met up at our friend Andrea's apartment to watch the premiere.
Well, except for me, because I'm in Hill, but
yeah, I guess if people don't know, John has relocated to the West Coast, so he wasn't on hand. But many of our other New York friends were all there. But so Doug, he had gone. They had this Iron Throne that was showing up in different cities, including New York. And so on Sunday it was at the corner of 14th and 9th Avenue, I think. And so they had it there. And so Doug went over and had his picture. You could sit on the Iron Throne, and apparently there wasn't exactly a line, but it was busy enough that every couple seconds or something, somebody new was sitting down, and so Doug got his picture taken on the Iron Throne, and then and they also had these rickshaw kind of things that were where the seats were sort of done up to look like the Iron Throne, and he had really wanted to ride one of those, but he hadn't got a chance. But just as he was getting off of the Iron Throne, one of those bicycle rickshaws, pulled up. So he rode that over to the subway, to take the L train over to Andrew's place. So he was. Oh, and then they interviewed him too for OMF Geek or something like that.
Yeah, no, I read about those rickshaws, and I was so sad that I'm not in the area right now so I can experience it.
And then they've had these food trucks going around where they're giving out Westeros food. I don't know, I didn't see any of them, but people have said they had lemon cakes and I don't know, boar and stuff, that the characters eat in the books.
Yeah, no, I've been really glad to see how much HBO is obviously behind the show. Besides the fact that, they greenlit the whole season, which, must have cost a fortune to produce given the epic scale of the show. But, man, the promotion. Oh, God, they're promoting the hell out of this thing.
Yeah, so everybody watch this, definitely give this show a chance, because I think this show is definitely, the success or failure of this show is going to determine a lot about the state of fantasy, on TV in particular, for years to come. But no, yeah, the day, the day that the show came out, I was just visiting all my usual websites, and every single site I visited, there was a Game of Thrones ad on it. Even the site I used to check my web stats and stuff.
I feel left out that we didn't get any of fantasy.
Well, maybe next year. Maybe for season 2, though. In terms of feeling left out, I can't believe they didn't send us a screener. They've been sending out these screeners to the first 6 episodes. If anyone from HBO is listening to this, and you have any of those screeners lying around, and you want to send it to somebody,
hello,
I'll take one, please.
Send the galaxy, bitches.
Especially considering some of the other people you sent them to who plainly didn't deserve them.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I guess that was one of the things too, is that the first 2 reviews that our friends kind of sent around were these really just nasty reviews, and so I was kind of I was really bummed out. I was it's kind of you have something that you really like, and then it's suddenly going to be getting this wider exposure, and you sort of imagine everyone else is going to like it, as much as you do. And then I was kind of like, I was getting a bad feeling. I was like, oh man, all the reviews they're just going to slam it. But then like almost every review I saw was really positive. It was just these two. There was one in Slate and one in the New York Times.
Well, and I would hesitate to call either of them reviews. I mean, they're both like screeds by the authors talking about like why fantasy sucks. Or the Slate one was hardly even that. It was like some sort of biographical essay about this guy's childhood or something. Like, who cares? Could you squeeze some review into this review, please? I mean, he barely took any time to actually comment on the series.
Yeah, I don't think either of them, from what I remember, neither mentioned like any of the actors or. Yeah,
they didn't do any of that typical stuff you expect to find in a review of something.
Actually, the Slate one, it was just real. Yeah, like you're saying. I mean, it was just, it was so embarrassing. It was giving me flashbacks back to my days in college when I was one of the editors on the college newspaper, and there was this one time where this freshman kid had written this. It was supposed to be funny, I think, but it was just really sort of stupid and insulting about the football team. And then like the football team was basically just following him around, like glaring at him, and like he would just be sitting in the dining hall, and they would just all like sit at the table next to him and just like sit there staring at him and stuff. But so this kid was like, I was like, never ever write anything like that again, And he's like, hey man, I used to write this stuff like this in high school and everyone loved it. And, I was like, dude, you're not in high school anymore, And I feel like, yeah, someone needs to sit down with this Slate guy and just say, dude, you're not in high school anymore. You need to have some baseline level of sort of professionalism and sort of basic writing competence.
Yeah. Although, I mean, as awful as that one was, I mean, by far the more obnoxious one I thought was the New York Times one by this Eugenia Belafonte. It makes these really troubling statements about women, and it's by a woman. It's just like, I can't imagine that like many women who read that weren't offended by it, and obviously it seems really strange.
But because I showed up at Andrea's apartment, when we were talking about that, and she's like, made me so angry. She's like, I had to just like go like run on the treadmill, for like half an hour to just like work out, just the rage that filled me from reading this stupid asinine piece of garbage review. It's kind of funny actually. I just looked up Eugenia Belafonte on Wikipedia, and it's like her whole entry it says that she's a critic for the New York Times and has also written for Time magazine. And then it says also, let's see, Belafonte's writing has been criticized for its superficial treatment of gender issues. Belafonte's 1998 Time cover story, Is Feminism Dead?, was critiqued by Erica Jong and described by Salon.com as poorly thought out. And Belafonte's 2011 New York Times review of the TV series Game of Thrones was widely criticized as sexist for suggesting that only sexual content might motivate women to watch a complex fantasy story. And that's her whole Wikipedia entry.
Mine's way longer than that. Yeah, but so, it's funny that Salon criticized her other review there that was mentioned in the Wikipedia page, because the Salon also actually criticized this new one. They actually, in response to these two awful reviews, the Slate one and the New York Times one, Salon actually wrote an article sort of reviewing those two reviews because they were so terrible.
Actually, somebody linked to a C.S. Lewis quote I hadn't seen before, but that I think is really good. But so he says, "It is very dangerous to write about a kind of story you hate. Hatred obscures all distinctions. I don't like detective stories, and therefore all detective stories look much alike to me. If I wrote about them, I should therefore infallibly write drivel. Criticism of kinds, as distinct from criticism of works, cannot of course be avoided, but it should not masquerade as criticism of individual works. Many reviews are useless because, while purporting to condemn the book, they only reveal the reviewer's dislike of the kind of thing to which it belongs." And I guess, there was George R. R. Martin actually, sort of made a reference to this on his blog. And then I guess it sounds like the New York Times had to just shut down comments on that review because so many, angry people were posting comments, which I think is very cowardly, if that's what they did.
Yeah. Well, what I heard was that their comment system couldn't handle it, but that there was so many people trying to comment. But if that's the case, that's pretty pathetic. I mean, they're the New York Times. But anyway, so What did you think of it more specifically? I mean, because you're like a scholar of this book. I mean, you've reread it a number of times, and like you could probably tell me the whole story of it right now. Don't, because we don't have time. But so what did you think? I mean, like I read it and I love the book as well. But I mean, I've only read it once, and I wouldn't consider myself a scholar of it.
Well, I mean, they had released this 12-minute. They released the first 12 minutes of the episode, so I actually watched that 5 or 6 times, and I really loved that. They made a few changes. One thing is that the Rangers come across, or I guess one of the Rangers initially comes across this clearing where he sees all these. In the book, he sees all these sort of lifeless bodies, and in the TV show they changed it so he comes across all these sort of, the bodies are all kind of chopped up and bloody, and there are decapitated heads impaled in stakes on the ground and stuff, and they're sort of arranged in sort of a circle or something, which I thought was it was really creepy. Although it did sort of make me wonder. I mean, kind of how I'd always imagined. I mean, I think what we're supposed to infer, happens in that scene is that he comes across these dead bodies and then they come back to life as zombies basically and sort of wander off. And so when he comes back again, they're gone. But I did sort of wonder then, like if they've all been hacked to pieces, where did all the pieces go?
Yeah. I wondered about that too. Yeah, because I mean that wasn't really clear what happened there. Just taking it from the show, without having the knowledge of the book.
So I mean there is something that happens later in the book that might maybe be a partial explanation for that, but I guess it is kind of a spoiler, so we won't talk about it right now. But so that was a change, and then another change is they made it so that there are sort of 3 characters that we see in that first scene. Waymar, Royce, Garrett, and Will. And in the book, Garrett is the one who survives and gets beheaded by Ned Stark, and they changed it to make it Will in the TV show, which I actually think is a pretty sensible change. I can sort of see why they made that change. It kind of makes more sense that you would see the younger guy, kind of scared out of his mind and incoherent and stuff. I guess like in terms of changes, they added a couple scenes that aren't in the book. Like we're introduced to Jaime and Cersei when they're still in King's Landing. They're sort of looking over Jon Arryn. I mean, I didn't think that scene was particularly necessary, but I could see why they would add it. It sort of sets up right away that there's this conspiracy, and it sort of since Jaime and Cersei are such major characters, it sort of establishes the ensemble nature of the story.
Yeah, I mean they needed some exposition in there. I mean, because that first episode is really dense. For people who haven't read the book, I mean, I think it was probably a lot harder to follow than maybe you might think. Since it so well, it's hard for you to tell, I would think. But, so I mean, I was watching it with one person who had read it and knew it very well, and so I'd read it. Christy had read it, and our friend John had read it, and he knew it really well. Christy sort of remembered parts, but not everything, and I also I remembered parts, but not everything. And then we had a fourth person who had never read it before. There was a few times where she was sort of a little confused, and so we just sort of stopped to give her a little bit of extra background. But I mean, I have to say though, it was not as confusing as I feared it would be, because I'd seen some reviews saying that you're going to need like a roster or something to keep track of all the characters. But I thought they did actually a really good job of introducing them, and without sort of hammering you over the head with the just this is this guy and this is this guy. I thought they did that all pretty well, given that it was incredibly difficult to actually get all of the names out there so that you can actually begin to understand who everyone is. Although they didn't manage to get around to introducing Theon Greyjoy. It's like he's there, but he's just he's just like some dude, and I was like, that must be Theon, I was waiting for someone to address him or something, but they never did.
I thought they did a good balance. I mean, if they were making it purely for people who had already read the books and knew them really well, I think they would have written the dialogue a little bit more naturalistically. I mean, that was one thing, is like a lot of the dialogue, I mean, you could tell that it was sort of written in a way to explain things to the audience,
Yeah.
It was sort of a weakness, but it was sort of an inevitable one.
So what do you think of the casting? Did anyone stand out for you, or anyone, either way, did anyone stand out either good or bad for you? in particular?
I mean, I thought the casting was fantastic. Really. I mean, some of the actors, like they didn't really match my mental image of the characters.
Yeah, sure, that's always going to happen.
Yeah,
but I thought they did quite a good job with that, though. That didn't happen too much with me. Tyrion actually, he's such an iconic character in the books, and it's like, I mean, Peter Dinklage is great, but I mean, he's not really what I pictured. I mean, he's like a pretty good looking guy.
Yeah, no, there's no question that Peter Dinklage is much better looking than Tyrion is described in the book.
Right.
But I mean, he just did a fantastic job, I thought. I mean, Rob was kind of complaining that he thought that the actor who played Robert he didn't look like he had ever, Robert is described as having been once like the most biggest badass, most muscular guy ever. And he's kind of like let himself go and now he's fat. Yeah. And the actor they have playing Robert, he doesn't look like he was ever really, the biggest, most buff, badass guy. In terms of his acting and everything, I thought he did a really great job. Yeah, I guess we should mention if people don't know that they invented a whole Dothraki language, for this show. It's funny, actually, George R. Martin has said that people ask him, people write him letters and they say, I'm really interested in High Valyrian, which is another imaginary language in the books. Could you send me a dictionary of it and stuff? And he says, I've made up 6 words in High Valyrian, and when I need a 7th one, I'll make up a 7th one.
Yeah.
But now, I guess they got a linguistics professor or something to actually do the whole Dothraki language, so it all makes sense and everything.
So I wonder if he's gonna, if he's just gonna pick that up and start using it for himself now. I mean, I guess he kind of has to keep it consistent, right? Otherwise, people are going to complain.
Yeah, and I don't see why he wouldn't want to. I mean, that just seems like
right. I mean, they've already done the work, right?
Fantastic resource. Yeah, actually, in one of those articles, I think it was in Laura Miller's article in the New Yorker, which is excellent. She says that George actually has trouble, that there are that there are fans who know the world better than he does, and that there's this guy Elio Garcia who's a big fan, and he's working with George on the sort of like World of Ice and Fire book that he that George actually like calls up Elio when he has a when he's like needs to check some detail about some obscure bit of the history or something. So I don't remember if Joffrey had any lines. Maybe he had 1 or 2. I don't remember, but
yeah, I don't think he does. He just sits there looking smug.
Yeah, no, but somebody said, that was great casting because I wanted to punch him in the face, even though he hadn't said anything.
Yeah, I agree. No, I agree totally. Yeah, I mean that was perfect. I mean, we'll see how he acts when he actually has something to say, but he looks the part for sure. Mm-hmm.
But it was I was kind of reminded of when in our interview with Daniel Abraham, he was talking about how hard it is to adapt Daenerys' storyline. And that was like, I did kind of feel like they were, that was something that they struggled with here because especially compared to the books, like so much of her, I mean, she's like one character who doesn't have anyone to confide in. So like we, our only way to know, and like her part, it's so much about her fears and like her gradually conquering her fears and, the sort of increasing and decreasing of her fears. And so like in the books, like when she rides the horse, that's a big moment for the first time. That's a big moment when some of her fears start to drain away. But when you do that on TV, it's like, oh, it's just somebody riding a horse, Yeah. I guess the other big change that occurs to me from the books is that in the books on Daenerys' wedding night, Khal Drogo is sort of unexpectedly gentle.
Oh yeah, right.
And it's almost kind of sweet. He sort of takes his time and undoes his hair, and I think she combs his hair, and it's like this long thing, and then she actually is sort of like consents, in the end. And in the TV show, I mean, it's very short and not nice at all.
Yeah.
And so I mean, I think that's a really tough choice, I think, because I mean, it does, it certainly changes how we view the characters from the way they are in the books. But I can sort of understand how, I mean, the one thing that I was sort of like, the Dothraki Wedding was sort of like my least favorite thing in this episode. I sort of couldn't ignore the feeling that I was on set with like extras and,
Yeah, it felt the least real of anything in that episode.
The Dothraki, don't come across well in this, in the first episode. And this is like kind of like another thing that's like hard to do on TV, as opposed to the book. Because like in the book, I mean, because the whole, it's necessary sort of for dramatic purposes that Daenerys is terrified and that all this seems just like strange and, and frightening to her. And in a book, you can say, like she felt like everyone was watching her, she was terrified. She felt like, that she didn't belong, that they weren't welcoming and all this stuff. And, maybe that's true and maybe it is, maybe they're just kind of acting kind of normal, sort of more normal. And that's just how she perceives it. And since we're in her point of view, we see how she perceives, their nasty looks and stuff like that. But then when you come to film it, you can only film it with them giving her scary looks and stuff. It's like I kind of like there's this scene where she like when she sort of I guess when when Drogo is presenting her the white horse and she kind of walks forward and the Dothraki are all kind of like, I don't know, I felt like they're kind of like crowding around her and all giving her like scary looks and stuff. And I could almost imagine like the director yelling, like, okay, extras, act scary, more menacing, and yeah, but I mean, and it's just necessary, for Daenerys's, character arc that all this stuff is, really scary to start off with. So it'll be interesting to see, what the Dothraki sort of look like, going forward from episode to episode. I guess, and you mentioned, I mean, another thing I could actually have done with like fewer boob shots on it, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Cause, like just every time, every time they had sort of like what seemed like kind of, more boob shots than necessary, it just made me kind of like remember that, sort of the thought that popped into my head was like, oh, they're doing this because it's HBO and HBO, this is what they do to like get ratings and stuff. And, that sort of just pulls me out of the story. And suddenly I'm not thinking about the fact that this is really happening, but I'm thinking about the fact that I'm watching an HBO show. And so, I mean, just for that reason alone, I wish there had been a little more subtle about that.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I even made a comment. So when Viserys is like first talking to Daenerys and he he takes her gown off and he's sort of ogling her and then he walks away and the camera angle is from behind her showing him walking away, and so like you sort of see her her butt and then they actually pan down and get the whole cheek, both cheeks all fully in frame. It's like, really? I mean, it seemed a little unnecessary. Given that, they're going to do more shots of her completely nude, in like, 10 seconds, because when she, turns around and walks into the boiling hot bath there.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was funny, when, Jordan was looking on her iPhone, to see like what people were saying on Twitter. And I guess one of the Twitter comments was, Game of Thrones takes place in a long ago sort of medieval society, long before the invention of the missionary position.
Yeah, I saw that. That was funny.
I guess that's a change. I mean, in the book, when Bran comes across Jaime and Cersei, Jaime kind of has Cersei pressed against the wall, and they changed that. I think I read something. Maybe they did it because Lena Headey was pregnant at the time.
Oh, really?
And so, like, they wanted her to be in like more comfortable position where it was easier to hide, her stomach and stuff. I mean, again, I'm sure that they couldn't make it any longer, but there were a couple of scenes where I really felt like they would have benefited a lot from just, being expanded a little bit. And like the scene with, like Daenerys' wedding night was one where I just felt like, if that had just, there had been sort of just more, if that had just gone slower, it would have been more effective. And that scene with Bran in the tower was another one where, I mean, in the book, it really, Bran's going to fall and Jaime sort of grabs him and helps him up. And, it seems like things are all right, and in the TV show, I felt like it was sort of too quick and casual.
Yeah, it's pretty accelerated. Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason for that, for them not being able to have the luxury, or I mean, one of the reasons they didn't have the luxury of expanding some of these scenes is that basically they felt like they had to end that episode with that scene with Bran getting pushed out of the tower.
Mm-hmm. I guess I mean, I agree that was absolutely the right place to end it, and I certainly don't wish that they had, ended the story early, at an earlier spot in the story. I just wish, that the episode had maybe been, 72 minutes long or something, Mm-hmm. Okay, so everything that you just heard that John and I just said was all recorded the day after the Game of Thrones premiere, and it is now 1 week later, and we just watched episode 2. So we're going to talk about that now. So, John, what'd you think of episode 2?
Yeah, well, I thought it was another great episode. Watching it is a little different for me this week than it was last week because since getting all excited about the series last week and talking about it with you, I started rereading the book Game of Thrones. I'm whereas I watched episode 1 without having read the book in a number of years and not remembering it all that well. I'm watching episode 2 with the book fresh in my mind. But still is quite good. I mean, there's a few things here and there where you notice there's differences from the book, but I don't recall anything that I thought was wrong. It was really awesome seeing the wall. That was an amazing shot, and we get a lot of good Tyrion stuff in this episode, and then Peter Dinklage is really growing on me more and more as Tyrion. They did a really good job of scruffing him up more too. It seems like he seems more Tyrion-like to me the more I see him. Yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, I thought it was pretty great all around. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. I mean, I went back and rewatched the first episode 2 more times, and now I actually went and watched this episode 3 times. Essentially back to back since it came out, and now I'm really getting into it. I mean, it's sort of the same thing like with I found with Lord of the Rings, where the first time I watched Fellowship of the Ring, when the Uruk-hai first came up on screen, I was just kind of like, oh, come on, those are guys in rubber costumes, And I really want to get into it, but it's like, the special effects just aren't quite there. But I found that once I watched it a couple more times, you can kind of, you sort of get acclimated to it, and you can kind of let yourself go with it more. And I'm finding sort of the same thing with Game of Thrones, that, the sets and special effects and stuff just aren't always there. But, once you sort of get used to it, you can kind of let your imagination go and get into it more.
Yeah, so one thing I was sort of wondering about is like as I was, obviously a lot of the events of the book are being compressed here, and a lot of ground is being covered fairly quickly. I am kind of starting to wonder, like, are we actually gonna be able to fit everything in the book into this first season? I mean, it sounds like the plan is to do the whole book in the first season, not bleed over into the second season, also being Game of Thrones, but. Yeah, I don't know, man. It seems like there's a lot of stuff that still needs to happen, and with only 8 more episodes after this, it's like how are we going to fit it all in?
I do sort of, as I was saying about the previous episode, I really wish these episodes were an hour and a half or maybe 2 hours, because a lot of the scenes just seem to go really fast. Like particularly the scene where the guy with the knife tries to assassinate Bran. That scene just seemed to go really, really fast. It's almost like that guy was in the room. Even before, it was just an instance after Rob left. Yeah. But that did actually make me wonder if we'll ever see some sort of extended edition for Game of Thrones like we did with Lord of the Rings. Because, I mean, they must have all sorts of bonus scenes that they've shot that got edited out. And, that might, allow them, if they do some sort of extended edition, that might allow them to insert in some more of the connective tissue stuff. And in particular, there was one thing missing from this episode. It's kind of a spoiler, but it has to do with that guy with the knife being sent to assassinate Bran. There's a scene that seems kind of integral to that's not here. So I'll be curious to see how they handle that moving forward. But I mean, I think sort of our one of the big things we were wondering about going into this episode was the guy playing Joffrey going to be able to, because we didn't hear him talk at all in the previous episode. Like, was he going to be able to act like enough of a dick to really be Joffrey? And I think he hit it out of the park as far as I'm concerned. Yeah,
no, totally, yeah.
One of the comments I saw in this episode, they said the only thing wrong with this episode was that he didn't get slapped enough.
Yeah. I mean, that was great too, though. I like that scene with Tyrion slapping him. That was great. And actually, I was glad we saw more of the Hound in this episode, because like in the first episode, we only see him with his helmet on, I think. In this episode, he's walking around without his helmet on, and so you can actually, you actually see pretty clearly that he's, burned up. And so, I mean, I was glad to see that detail still there, that they didn't just, make him not have that characteristic.
Mm-hmm. Although I'm a little concerned with how he doesn't quite act like the Hound to me so far, because I think of the Hound as being just really poisonously cynical. And sort of amoral and intimidating, and he's described as having this raspy voice. And in the show so far, he seems kind of just sort of an average guy. So he hasn't had a whole lot to do yet. So I'll reserve judgment. But so that and like the scene where it's him and Sansa and Illian Payne was sort of the weakest part of this episode for me. Illian Payne just seemed kind of comically weird to me more than like scary.
Yeah, and that was actually a really good scene in the book too, and it didn't quite play as well as it did on it didn't quite play as well on the show.
Although I have to say, one thing I really liked in this episode was Sean Bean's acting. There's a popular fan theory for who Jon Snow's mother is. And if you are sort of thinking of that when you watch the scenes where where the issue of Jon Snow's mother comes up, just the way he acts those scenes, I think is just so amazingly good. So, I mean, one of the big changes from the book is that there are no dream sequences in the TV show. Did you notice that?
I would be surprised if the next episode doesn't begin with Bran's dream sequence, even though we see him wake up at the end of this episode. Because, I mean, that was kind of important, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly in the book it is. I mean, I don't know how else they might handle it. I mean, they might, since the stuff that kind of comes up in the dream doesn't really play a role in the plot until much later in the story, they might just push, sort of kick that down the road
right.
quite a bit. But
yeah, and I mean, I guess, did Daenerys have any dreams by this point in the book?
Yeah.
I mean, because her dreams are really important too, I would think, to have in the show. So, I mean, I hope we're going to see some of those at some point. Although her timeline has been shifted around a bit here and there on the show compared to how it is in the book. So,
but I mean, I think a lot of it is just time, and also I think it's just hard to do dream sequences on a TV show. It's hard to not make them come across as just cheesy,
Yeah. Oh, so I notice Theon Greyjoy has he continues to be prominently in the episode when we still haven't heard his name.
Yeah. Maybe they can keep that going all season long.
It's like, who is that guy? Why is he always there? Why is he always smirking?
I mean, one big change that they made was that, there are these moments that are sort of, I think, controversial among fans. Because, if you've read the whole series and you go back and read Game of Thrones, there are just some moments where where it almost feels like the characters are a bit out of character, like they weren't completely in focus yet. So like one of them is when in the scene, we actually saw it in the last episode where Tyrion talks to Jon Snow outside the feast. Tyrion sort of like is revealed to be this amazing gymnast, and then it never really comes up again. And so they edited that out, and a lot of people sort of feel like that, that part where he just springs, or he does all this gymnastics, it just doesn't seem consistent with Tyrion as he develops later into the story. And then another one of those is, and I was really sort of anticipating this in this episode, but when Jon Snow goes to say goodbye to Bran, as he's leaving, Catelyn says to him, "It should have been you. It should have been you who, is in a coma." Yeah. And they left that out. I was a little relieved that they did.
Okay. Yeah.
Because like a lot of people have said that they just could never have any sympathy or affection for Catelyn after that moment. And I don't know, it seems like there's enough in the story to make you dislike Catelyn that, maybe cutting out a thing here or there where she doesn't come across well might not be such a bad thing. I guess there were a couple of things I noticed in the last episode, rewatching it, that I hadn't noticed when we talked before. But one of them is you can see Hodor in the.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in the
I didn't notice them. Yeah.
When Robert comes in, when Robert first rides into Winterfell, and all the sort of Winterfell inhabitants are standing or kneeling there, you can see this just gigantic guy.
Okay.
And I'm sure that must be Hodor. One thing that I thought was kind of cool that I didn't notice on my first viewing is that in the first Daenerys chapter, it's mentioned that there are Unsullied, who are these soldiers. They have these sort of spikes on their caps, and they become really important in the third book. And so it's kind of, so I didn't really notice them on my first read. And so it's really, that's another one of those things where you read the whole series and you go back and you're like, oh wow, they were mentioned that early in the series. But you can sort of, during the Dothraki Wedding, you can kind of see them standing around. I think maybe at Illyrio's mansion, you can kind of see them just kind of standing around in the background. That's kind of a cool detail. Yeah,
actually, I noticed in the book too that at least in that opening prologue, they only call them the others. And then it's not until like later on that somebody else uses the term White Walker, but I guess they wanted to have a unified term for those creatures and just went ahead with the White Walkers. Oh, so I was sort of chuckling about this, but like when I went back and started rereading, I had forgotten that they were called the others, and then but then I was thinking about George R. R. Martin's recent comments about Lost, and I was like, oh, that's part of his resentment for Lost is that he's mad that they stole his others from him.
Mm-hmm.
Because on Lost, the bad guys are called the others.
Yeah, because I don't know if people didn't follow this. Damon Lindelof, who was one of the guys who ran Lost, he recently, George R. R. Martin was quoted in a magazine interview just in passing as saying that he didn't want to pull a Lost with the series, and have all these loose ends at the end, and
have the finale retroactively ruin the entire.
Yeah, I was trying to be nice, but and so Damon Lindelof kind of took exception to this and announced that he was launching a Twitter war with George R. R. Martin. Well, first he said, these comments from George R. R. Martin, this is going to keep my therapist in money for some time to come. Mm-hmm. But then he announced he was going to start a Twitter war with George R. R. Martin, and then he joked, the problem with being in a Twitter war with George R. R. Martin is it takes him 6 months to respond.
Yeah, it was all pretty funny.
Yeah. But boy, I sure hope George doesn't pull a Lost with the series. I actually was just reading that he apparently he told the showrunners for Game of Thrones, David Benioff and Dan Weiss, sort of the Cliff Notes version of how the series is going to end. So in case anything happens to him, they'll be able to end it and kind of. Really? That's what I read.
Yeah, so that's interesting because I heard somewhere that George Martin had said that he specifically doesn't want anyone to finish his work if he dies. So like in the case of like Robert Jordan, where Robert Jordan died with Wheel of Time unfinished and Brandon Sanderson was hired to finish it. I heard somewhere that Martin had said that he specifically doesn't want that to happen, and that he that I guess he has arrangements in place for that to happen.
But that's what I read in this interview, that he told Dave and Dan this, so I don't know, it might just be different when somebody else is sinking hundreds of millions of dollars into a TV show.
Right. Oh, well, no, I mean, I'm sure it wasn't even a question for HBO. I mean, there's no way that they would have, started to shoot the show if they thought that they wouldn't be able to, finish it if they want to. Yeah, I mean, I just thought that was interesting, given that he had said that,
And it does sort of give you confidence that that there is an ending that he's shared with people.
Well, hopefully they keep the lid on that and it doesn't get reported in in the media ever.
I mean, one thing just reading commentary online, a lot of people noticed was that the dire wolves seem somewhat absent from a lot of the scenes. Like people were particularly remarking on Jon Snow's dire wolf ghost. Mm-hmm. You would sort of expect to see him running alongside Jon, as they're all leaving Winterfell and stuff like that, and you don't. I was reading that, I guess people are sort of reporting that the dogs turned out to be harder to train than they were expecting, and so, they kind of maybe didn't use them, or were kind of only using them for the scenes where they absolutely had to be in there.
Mm-hmm. And that was pretty brutal, actually, at the end of the episode, where Lord Stark has to go and kill Lady. I was figuring that they were probably going to do that off screen. It's like, human brutality is fine to show on screen, but you can't show anyone beheading an animal. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that was probably about as well as they could have done that. I mean, that was going to be a really hard scene to film no matter what.
And it was kind of chillingly effective to me how they cut from that to Bran waking up,
Mm-hmm. Oh, actually, one thing, speaking of scenes being compressed, I felt like the scene with Arya and Nymeria, where she's out in the woods and she's trying to make her dire wolf run away, so that she won't get killed. That seemed like that happened really fast. Like, I think it would be pretty hard to convince that dire wolf to leave her.
Mm-hmm.
It's like she hit her once with a rock. It's like I think they should have had a few more rocks thrown or something. I mean.
I don't know how many minutes do you want to take up though with like the girl hitting the dog with rocks? I mean,
it's hard, but I mean, Well, I mean, the thing is, though, that could have been like a good emotional scene, and I felt like it didn't really, it never really got to the point where you could even be emotional about it because it was over so quickly, you know.
Yeah.
I guess there's only so much direwolf emotional scenes you can have in one episode, and they saved it all for Lady at the end. So, any predictions for next week?
I'm really looking forward to seeing Arya learning some sword fighting skills. I think we might be starting that next week.
Yeah, those are some of my favorite scenes in the first book. And I can't wait to see some of the stuff that I know is coming.
What I heard was that the actress who's playing Arya, Macy Williams, had read the books and she knew that Arya was supposed to fight left-handed, and so she didn't want them. She was afraid that, and she's actually right-handed, and she was afraid that if she told the producers that she was right-handed, that they would just decide to make Arya right-handed. So she pretended to be left-handed because she wanted that detail in the TV show.
That's awesome. Wait, how old is that kid?
I don't know, like 12 or something, I think.
Wow. Not only did she read all the books at that age, but then she actually cared that much about that detail that she that she would like learn how to like fence left-handed or whatever. That's pretty amazing. I mean, I was already really impressed with her as an actress as it is. I mean, she seems to be nailing Arya pretty good. But wow, that's pretty impressive.
Okay, but I mean, overall, I think we're both really happy with how Game of Thrones is going, and definitely looking forward to checking out future episodes. And so I think that's our episode. And, we're now sponsored by Audible.com. And so, if you want to help out the show, you can go to our website at geeksguideshow.com and click on one of the ads for Audible and sign up for a free trial subscription. Maybe a book that you might want to check out is Hunter's Run by Daniel Abraham and Gardner Dozois and George R. R. Martin that came up in the interview. And then another one you might want to check out is the anthology Warriors, edited by George R. R. Martin. And it includes his new Duncan Egg novella, The Mystery Knight. And, both of those available on audible.com.
All right. Well, that was our episode, and thanks for listening. If you want to... Another way you can support the show is if you want to leave a comment on IO9, that lets them know that you love us. Or if you want to go to iTunes and leave a rating or a review there, we're up to 50 ratings. So if you like the show, go over there and give us a 5-star rating or whatever you think we're worthy of. And if you don't like the show, don't do that. Just don't rate us at all because we don't want any 1-star ratings. So I mean, those are other ways you can support the show. And thanks again for listening.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of IO9. For this episode's show notes, to subscribe to this podcast, or for more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your hosts, visit johnjosephadams.com or davidbarkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Slipgate 9 Entertainment. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.